So, I mean, I wonder if Jonathan should really start by introducing the thematic stuff because I did so little fucking work. But uh, Jonathan, do you have things you want to open? So the way we usually do it is that we take a look at those themes and try to extract some points. I didn't do my work, um, but I think you did. If you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, so just to maybe kind of take a step back of at least the themes that I think we sort of discussed prior. Like one of the things that I think that was super interesting as we were trying to like come up with ideas for how to organize this was trying to at least have some sort of grounding on like how did we get to where we are? So like monopolies and anti-competitiveness. I think there are some interesting things that hopefully we can dive into in a second about what is like good and bad about a monopoly. And I think without having that grounding, it's hard to sort of identify what are the bad things that can come out of what we see today. Because I do think there is a version, and especially when we think about like the modern application of like how do we treat things like a COVID response, like coming up with like what are the things that we're trying to protect against and where is like they're good and where is they're bad, and also monopoly versus centralization, are those two necessarily the same thing, are kind of interesting points. Anywho, so I think like the genesis of this was, as we were discussing in preparation for the call, was trying to figure out how do we get like some sort of basis so we can talk about like what are ways that, and I wouldn't even argue that the three listings that we have are like comprehensive. They're just like how the EU and the US historically looked at monopolies and anti-competitive work, and whether those are even like sufficient definitions is maybe an interesting opening place to start. But then trying to dive into if those are at least necessary, like some bounding conditions, are they sufficient for like all the scope of things? Because they focus in very sort of like ambiguous, well, some ways very specific, some more ambiguous. Then trying to piece out what are the things that we think we should address, like what are the things that are potentially good that can come from them / bad, and then diving into like maybe what are we seeing today? Because I think we have a really practical example that we could talk about. So maybe starting at least at the beginning here with like the anti-competitiveness thing. I don't know, maybe to open up, I'm not sure who is able to actually take a look or read. Is there someone who'd like to give a quick summary or like high level take from the readings of, like I can give my 2 cents of like, if I was to give my takeaways from the readings, like how I see the two differences between like EU and US and like how they think about the world. So my understanding, and people correct me if I have walked away with a false one, is like the US, the way that the US has historically approached antitrust, that's changed pretty significantly. And I think it was Milton Friedman who is like proposed, or what they claim, who proposed like the way that we should consider antitrust is from a very consumer driven lens, where like the primary argument ends up being around, and I think like the actual history of this, which is not in a reading, there's like some really interesting case about how like supermarkets, there was some antitrust case that was brought against like some supermarkets that got like 10% market share or something in some region. And like there was an antitrust case brought against them. And then Milton Friedman wrote this whole thing that became like very popular, which was like, if it's not hurting the consumer, then why do we care? Which is basically like how the US thinks about the world. And largely, I think the legislation that's been like passed and the way that it's been pursued in courts has been around like price. And so if you can't, and it's interesting because when we talk about consumer harm, we're talking about a specific like lens of consumer harm. We're talking about it from this one kind of imperfect metric of did you pay too much or not? And I think that's an interesting contrast to the European definition. And like there's functional differences in the law as well, where like the European law is not written as specifically, it is written, and I think in the, I forgot which article, one of them talks about this, where like the two key operative words inside of like the EU legislation is for example, where they say like, this should not hurt consumers. And for example, like there's a number of things that are listed. But by saying, for example, it gives the European courts a lot of flexibility when they define what has actually violated consumer like need, or like what is put, or what is like disadvantaging consumers. And that's been pretty broadly interpreted to also include things that have been stifling competition or made it like less useful for not less useful for users necessarily, but it's like things that would prevent one group from having too much power. So I think that's like the high level grounding. There's like, I think both views of the world, the EU and the US, center on we want to do things that are good for consumers. I think the definition of what good is I think where things are kind of fuzzy. And in the US and in the classic American form, we think of it as like the purely economic lens of the world and not necessarily what are the other externalities. Are we truly pricing in all the other forms of harm, whether it be fewer options, which is how the European courts have interpreted it, or does it mean to violations or potential violations of civil liberties? You can even look at like other readings that were not included, like what are like potential national security risks? If you think about it from if one org has too much data and Saudi Arabia, like they did with Twitter, pays a Twitter employee $300,000 to leak information, is that dangerous too? Anyway, so sorry, that is going a little too far. I think from a grounding perspective, would love to hear other people's reactions or thoughts.
Yeah, I really like, I mean, that's a really great summary. The only thing that I would maybe pick on a little bit is the US one definitely has this metric around price versus the EU one, based on that New Yorker article. My impression was that it talked about, in both of them, the intent was to not stifle innovation. The idea was that monopolies stifle innovation, but then it was kind of a question of innovation to what end, and the American interpretation ended up being innovation to the end of consumer protection versus EU take is maybe innovation as an end in itself. And sort of contrast that with, from the Goliath reading, there was that Brandeis quote, which is, anyone living under a monopoly is subject to the whim and caprice of a few self-appointed industrialists and is therefore not a free citizen, versus this concept, which is much more Friedman, that regulation of any kind is inherently bad and stifling to free democracy.
B5, you got something to say there? Looks like.
Do you have something to say? Do you want to say something first?
I mean, I think that there are these, well, the EU-US divide to me in some ways is, you know, was useful to hear, but is like, for me, in a little, to a certain extent, uninteresting. Like, I don't care what's been kind of instantiated as law in different jurisdictions. I am interested in what models exist for describing the what are the ills that can result from monopolistic capitalism, or yeah, just from monopolies in general. And it seems to me that there are like two main conceptions at work in the conversation so far. One is purely about consumption, and the other has been described here as innovation, but it seems to me it just has a broader conception of what bads result from monopolies. So like, so I mean, these are really two different lenses. One is there an economic penalty that we pay for the existence of a monopoly? And the other is there some form of social good which is sacrificed when a monopoly comes into being? And that social good could be, you know, like kind of economic in a broad sense. So it could involve innovation, or it could have like a kind of less well-defined ill effect on like a kind of moral effect, you know, on how we live, how we think of ourselves, how we relate to one another in a society, you know, and as Brandeis says, it has some effect on freedom, whatever that means. And it seems to me that ultimately this broader conception is the one that's interesting, right? Like, we wouldn't be all like up in arms about the monopolies that Google and Apple exercise for the sake of $7 a month or $28 a year. Like that, I just can't believe that would like get us all get our boxers twisted in a knot. But I think it's the idea that there's some moral harm that comes to us as a result of living under a monopoly, and that's why we care.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of really good points, Matt. The sort of broader theme is the one that's interesting, but I don't think that I think that the specifics of as Kelsey sort of pointed out in chat, this idea that having these two interpretations are really important. I think antitrust is a really interesting category of work, right? It's this very strange pressure release valve for an otherwise balanced, seeming to some balanced capitalist equation, right? This idea that, it all works hunky-dory, it's fine, but again, this isn't necessarily my view, but in the traditional interpretation of society as a functioning working thing, you have this we need, capitalism is great, unbridled capitalism is a problem, generally we need some sort of referee, right? And that's, I think, sort of where antitrust, the existence of antitrust as a category of thought, as a category of laws and as enforcement, the existence of the regulation that derives from that is all sort of it is an admission that there's a rounding error here. There's a thing that needs to be brought in to sort of balance this seemingly perfect equation. And I think that it's really interesting to dive into I'm going to quote Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, to descend into the particulars on this one and really see how it shakes out, right? Because I think the framing of consumer good that you see in the US is like exhibit A of where a data monopoly it is, as Jonathan said, like a failure to price in certain problems become really they sort of become a way to carve around a lot of this. And if you read any of Jeff Bezos's letters to his investors, it is a magnum opus on antitrust, right? He's a masterful mind when it comes to designing something that evades the current understanding of antitrust in the world. And then I think the EU's interpretation of something as being far more broad, but also the EU is continually accused of being non-specific, and the big American engines of capital, like Google's and the Apples of the world, are very frustrated with the EU, right down to requiring the USB-C port on their or USB Mini. What did they settle on for charging phones? Yeah, right. I think there's a really, and I think those particulars are really interesting, and they're a really interesting point for departure because they really quickly get you back to the big conversations really quickly, because they're the result of a lot of thought, right? They're the result of someone trying to say, oh, let's just reduce it down to this. And Friedman's sort of characterization of consumer good or consumer benefit is, Milton Friedman had a lot of ideas that really didn't scale well. And this might be one of them.
I think one of the interesting points, just to build off what you were saying, but touches on the one specific example and the what are things we worry about with monopolies, those two readings. Basically, it's an interesting use case looking at the Getty and the Google thing, where it's here is an example where there is a clear harm, maybe not to the direct consumer, but to the suppliers of Google is enabling the piracy, whether willfully or not, of a bunch of information they're stealing ad revenue too from Getty, and that's causing material harm to all the people up that chain. And so of course the EU does what seems like the right thing and enables Getty to actually pursue and win a case against Google. And yet that leads to a quote unquote, it leads to outrage from people. And there is a question also of yeah, I mean, $7 a month is not a huge fee if that's what you were paying to pay for Google services, but are we too cheap to even do it? Should it just be a matter of what is the choice and the optionality? And I think about this a lot with all the sites that have done GDPR stuff. They require you to acknowledge, and we have gone from you have no choice to, because you have so much choice, you will just on autopilot be yep, okay, I just want to get to my, or yeah, I think there's something, there's even a design question here, which is can you even get away from it? Because like, if the volume of things that you need to end up doing in order to protect against some of these bad things is so high friction, then you end up just like people collapse under their weight. But I see a hand from Kelsey.
Yeah, I mean, just from what you were talking about, and then this diverges from the reading, so I guess everybody's welcome to bullshit on this, but what do we see as the role of open source in sort of combating that like gap between, well, we don't want to pay for stuff, but also we want stuff to be good and free and not a monopoly company?
Can I go here? Or Matt, do you want to go? I think it's really dangerous. I think that burdening open source with filling some missing piece is like so problematic. Like, I think that that's the bad side of open source, right? This expectation that there is just this like untapped vast well of developer that is willing to sort of like fill the necessary gaps in our stack is just painful. And I think that the GDPR stuff really speaks to this, right? Like, there's been how much ink spilled over the way that the regulations put out through GDPR places undue burden on small companies that are far less able to sort of deal with this. And oh, somebody will open source a thing. Yeah, but like it's a very frustrating thing. That is another issue in another queue, and another burnt out developer somewhere. Thanks. And like, that's another, license change to somebody saying we're no longer can support the open source side of this. Like, I think
Yeah.
that's my rant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's a solution. I'm not saying that. I mean, like, it doesn't work if all open source is done for free, but it doesn't have to be the same thing. I'm a firm believer in the existence of some middle ground utopia where you can have open source and paid developers. It must exist.
Peter.
So the title here is Data Monopolies. Have we defined a data monopoly, or was there a definition in the reading that we agree on?
Yeah, I think so far we've mostly I've been wanting to get to a data monopoly proper instead of just monopolistic activity more broadly. Maybe somebody else should say what we really mean by data monopoly, since I haven't thought too much about it. But
can you give examples of what feels like a data monopoly to you?
So one thing that that Jonathan was discussing was the geographical data sets owned by Google and Apple. So, of course, monopoly is maybe a little too strict a term, but these are non-competitive databases for two sets of users. And they, the fact that, the kind of possession of those data sets confers to the owners a set of privileges that a kind of market position into ecosystems that what's the word I want to use? That's like an advantage multiplier, right? So they have these market positions that are already well entrenched, and the construction of their services around data to which they and only they have control is a way of rendering permanent their market advantages. So that's one way to think about that movement data. And then it's been interesting during COVID to watch them try to figure out how to deploy that data in something like the common good. And so that's sort of an example, Peter, is that, and maybe Jonathan has something to say, or Peter, you want to just go?
I was just gonna quickly tap, just to underscore, I don't know if we actually ever formally defined it. I think the idea of a data monopoly is just taking, as I am currently defining it in my head, is like taking the ideas of like, why do we refer to it as a monopoly? And that's where like usefully grounding ourselves and like, how have we thought about what a monopoly is previously? And applying it to a specific context, which is when we think about data and like exactly what you were describing. I actually linked to something that I did not include in the cut for the reading, which is Ben Thompson talks about this idea of like aggregator theory. And he applies it more broadly than just for like the specific tech platforms that are doing things with like user data. He applies it to like Netflix and other things as well. But I think there's a point that you made that I think really nicely intersects there, which is like, you have this ephemeral thing that is like you could think of like the social graph of like, how do we know each other and like know other things? And that's not something that is owned by Facebook. But there is like a function of like, by us all having put in that data into the specific organization, like they now sort of are claiming ownership of that, the maintenance of those relationships. And there's something to be said about how that there's like market potential where like Facebook can cut off access to other apps, and like there is like from other aspects like economic impacts from like companies that can or cannot exist or need to exist within like the rule of like Facebook. But I think there's like an underlying issue, which is it's not a pricing issue. This is like a power issue of like, when we think about how is that like power leveraged if like specific people want to like, at least, yeah, in my view, yeah, the main issue is when you have these types of things that have a whirlpool effect, where as more people adopt, like more of this data is like pumped into this one monopoly. And if we assume, or we don't challenge the notion that this is like owned by a specific organization, or that this data should be owned by an organization, then I think there's questions that fall out about, yeah, what are like the restrictions on power, or do they have unbridled power? And I think like, one of the things that's interesting, I think, that we may or may not see in this COVID era is there are applications where like having these organizations with such a vast reach and like pretty comprehensive like ability to use the data how they need to has led to like some positive social outcomes, where like Facebook is like publishing data on like how fast are people spreading, like, or like not socially or not maintaining quarantine, and like Google and like Apple are able to leverage those data assets to like publish or create this like contact or like large scale contact tracing thing for the world, which is amazing. I think there are questions still about how like, yeah, how is that decision making being made? There are still other questions about what other like consequences, and also like one thing we haven't even touched on, which I didn't even think about prior to the reading, is like natural monopolies as like a thing that exists as well with like utilities, where like we agree that there are certain things where it makes sense to have like one entity like just build and maintain the thing, and like there are rules and restrictions around it, but we haven't really talked about that in a tech context either. But to bring it back to your point, I think that is what I think of when I think of data monopolies. I'm thinking mainly from the user context, and that then ends up boiling down to like a handful of like very specific tech entities. I don't know if other people have different definitions.
Sorry, my internet keeps cutting out, but B5, I saw your hand out, and I missed the last little bit of yours. Sorry, Jonathan.
No worries.
Yeah, I think I have a definition of a data monopoly that I personally use, and it's more boring, it's less useful, and has a bit of a higher bar. I think higher bar, not in the good, not that it's more valuable because it's higher. But I think it's important to like distinguish between, like the way that I sort of understand this problem is like through the idea of like, is this a monopoly or is this an economy of scale? Meaning like, if we consider the original notion of a monopoly, like you could say, hey, Apple has a monopoly on the iPhone. It's like, you know, or Apple has a monopoly on great laptops. And it's like, well, no, they have an economy of scale. It's very expensive to spin up a company that makes laptops, and they've figured out a way to sort of get there. And I think that's kind of healthy innovation, where you see a lot of folks who can sit in garages and figure out ways to create these breakthrough things that sort of like work well. And then I think a monopoly if we use the classic thing and then sort of leverage ourselves into the data side, monopoly is quite specifically, it's when a actor in a market leverages their position to suppress competition. That may not be the right definition, but that's generally kind of the vibe we're working with. And I think when you use the phrase data, or when we talk about the phrase data monopoly, I think it's really important to sort of distinguish those two things. And I think that I sort of subscribe pretty heavily to the belief that all data is about people and all data has some grounding in reality. Almost everything all data at some level is an observation of what we call the real world and structured into some way and jammed into a database somewhere. And I think that's really important when you talk about a data monopoly, because I think for something to constitute a data monopoly, the actual correctness of the data must reside with the owner of the data, which is distinct from the observed world style of data, right? And I think that the Facebook sort of example is a really great place where I actually don't think that Facebook's social graph is a data monopoly, because at the end of the day, my friends are my friends and I choose who they are. And if I ever logged onto Facebook and said unfriend this person, and Facebook said no, or if I discovered that they continued to advertise us as friends elsewhere, I would be very frustrated. I might leave Facebook. I think I know a thing to be true. I believe a thing to be true, and Facebook is not the arbiter of that truth. Yeah, people you may know type stuff. And I think this gets sticky, but bear with me for a second. I think that it's important that I think it should be a very high bar for someone to say that you have a data monopoly. Data monopoly should imply that if we change this number in this database, you are no longer friends. That should be the bar for a social graph monopoly. Maybe that's true.
Posit that there is to use a different example, and maybe this is a good and useful one. It's does Amazon have monopoly on online sales? Functionally, you could argue no. You could easily stand up your own website, but what percent of e-commerce is going through Amazon? And I think there's a similar effect when you think, even if you as the user get to modify and update the data, there is a question to what is the ability of a competing social network or anyone else to actually create that data asset? And does Facebook, by its mere existence, negate that network effect? And I wonder, some of it is kind of anti-competitive in the actions Facebook takes. So obviously you look at what does Instagram do when Snapchat is about to release something, rip as quickly as possible. But I think there's also this lock-in mechanism as well, which is what do they do that is kind of anti-user but pro Facebook, and so there's specific actions on the platform. But I think then also if you were to say I need to leave Facebook, how do they enable that? So while yes, you do own the correctness of the data, do you actually or if you were to turn off your profile, I think now with GDPR, there's some more information, or there are more rights associated with you, but there are still questions about what has already been scraped and pulled elsewhere. I forgot the name. There's Clearview AI has been in the news as super creepy on this front, but yeah, do you even have control at that point? And I think there's then an underlying technology. So those are two divergent thoughts, but the first one being I think there is maybe it is an economies of scale, and at a certain functional scale you suffocate everyone else. The act of you building out your social network again is pretty high, and maybe one might argue that that's not impossibly high, but I do wonder if there is something there. And then two is, what are the choices if Zuckerberg has the ability to do, or what sort of choices do we then subscribe to based on if Facebook has the ability and the ability to keep most of us on there and retain this information, what choices are we subjected to outside of that from what algorithms or value choices that are made on our behalf that get surfaced? And all of this stems, I think, from they can maintain the data, or they have an ability to make it harder to migrate off of their platforms, which, yeah, I don't know, maybe it doesn't meet the bar of monopoly. It's a something, I don't know what it is.
Beefel, looks like you have a response, but we'll get Peter in first.
Um, yeah, it's hard. There's a real loss. I mean, you know, one of the biggest themes in a relationship to Facebook is this feeling of loss of control. And it isn't just about data, right? It isn't just about data or representation. It's about, you know, to what extent we can shape our social relationships and so forth. I think like all this gets really, you know, if we talked about like where do our intuitions for monopolies come from, and for me, it's like the company town at the company store, and your ability to choose alternatives. And in that environment, it's pretty clear, you know, what an alternative to the company store might look like. But like, what service is Facebook providing? I'm sure they have some very carefully chosen narrative that their lawyers would present in answering that question, but each of us actually does use it a little bit differently. It plays a whole bunch of different kind of roles in social life, in you know, organizing community events, and you know, getting your brand out there, whatever. And so it's really hard to think about. I think, you know, any one of those people might be able to bring a case about how they don't have a real alternative. Is data central to that? I mean, I guess, is data the unit of control? Is it the mechanism? Is it the forum? I don't know, you know, just sort of on a philosophical level, I don't really know how to grapple with this. But it is really deep, really close to my heart, and in particular that that sense of control is not just the data itself that I put in there, you know, the particular records of interaction or whatever, but my ability to shape those interactions, right, which is a bit more what people are concerned with the timeline, which is actually super disempowering, because nobody knows even how it works. You know, if they shape the UI in a particular way, and that impacts how I can interact with the world, or they change the sort of you know, spam control, whatever, like that's one thing I can sort of understand now. I have no idea what's going on with it. I can't say, you know, like, show me all of the coefficients for how much you think I like this person so I can tweak them. So I don't know, all of this, I don't really know where to start. I think Facebook is an especially confusing place for me to start. If we think that there's a class of things that are data monopolies, Google Maps is a little bit easier for me to grapple with. Yeah, go ahead.
I think Brendan had a hand, right?
I did.
Yeah,
Do you want to go, Kelsey? No, okay. Yeah, I think I would posit your social security number, your credit score. Those I think are better examples of like things that are in fact condoned monopolies, where we say, hey, like if someone changes your social security number, your life is over. Like you're not, there's the source of truth for social security numbers is whatever, when somebody looks up a social security number and whatever answer they get back, that's the source of truth. Your credit score, right? Like when whoever controls the association between your name and your credit score, that is where there's an inversion between what's real on the ground, right? My actions, and a figure in a database, and where a modification of that database has horrific real impacts that go the other way, that impact sort of the real world, not necessarily starting from like who my friends are and sort of propagating outward. And I think that's where like whoever has control over those things become like really, to me, that would be the examples, would be examples of monopolies that I think are an easier framework for understanding what a monopoly is. Because I think it's really important to cleave apart something that can be frustrating or bad or an economy of scale from like, okay, like where do we need to step in from the regulatory perspective? And that should be a really, really, really like break glass in case of emergency moment in my mind. If like
there should be other mechanisms to fix stuff like Facebook being terrible.
So coming all the way back to Peter's question, what's a data monopoly? What's become clear to me here is that we don't have a great solid definition, which I think is a valuable and unsurprising result. So I checked the dictionary online in the meanwhile, and a monopoly is, quote, the exclusive possession or control of the supply of or trade in commodity or service. I think that's from Oxford, which is really not what we're talking about here. Brendan's definition definitely talked about active suppression, which leads me to the question of, like, is it possible then to accidentally or incidentally be in a monopoly if you're not being evil per se? Can you still be a monopoly? Because kind of, yeah, I think. Then there's the kind of the pragmatic definition that you can get out of the Getty lawsuit. They had this great quote in there, which is that the Getty folks, the Getty folks were suing Google over this whole image available in HD thing. They were saying, well, nobody visits our site anymore because your site just finds our stuff and surfaces it to people better, which totally sensible. And then Google said, well, fine, we can exclude you if you want. You can either be on our site or not be on our site. And the Getty response was that that was no option at all. Quote, allowing the harm to continue or becoming invisible on the internet. And that's a pretty great pragmatic definition of monopoly, is like, you do it our way or you don't exist. I have more to say, but I'll stop there.
I think that's important. That was an important moment because it showed it. So Google has monopolistic power as a search provider. That is power. That is, however, power over data. So what it fundamentally has is a gigantic database of links and how they're related to each other, and so and it leverages that power in lots of different ways, and you know, in this case with Getty, to force conformance to its kind of parameters. That's distinct from what Brendan was talking about, it seems to me, where because I don't think it's the same thing as being the source of truth. I thought that nonetheless, I was really interested in why we tolerate a government monopoly on the assignment of social security numbers. And it seems to me there are probably really good reasons to do so, right? Which you might question if you start to question the legitimacy of the state. So I don't know. I was pretty interested in both. I didn't want to drop that, but I thought what Kelsey said there was really insightful.
I can expand on that thing I dropped in the chat, which was just in the case of the Getty versus Google, like, so Google has a bunch of data that allows it to that is, you know, that means it protects it from competition by other search engines. Getty's problem is one of publicity, and Google is the only way that it can get that it's Google or nothing. Just so those are just sort of two different issues, or issues at two different levels of. Does that make sense, or did you have? I don't know that I had anything deeper to say than that.
That was really interesting. Just by itself, it's an important point. There's a lot of different ways that very wise-looking quote could be interpreted.
Oh yeah, I'm good at that, and it gave me plenty of time to figure out what I meant before Go ahead, be fine.
That was great. Yeah, I think you did a really good job of cleaning apart the two, right? Like, I think there is a classic monopoly, but today we're talking about data monopolies. Like, what's that? I think we're exploring what this term even means. We kind of just threw it at the wall, and I think that this is the perfect way to do this, right? And if we spend the whole time defining a data monopoly, I think that's a really worthwhile exercise. Because I think we had some talking about sort of like the notion of data monopolies in the era of coronavirus. And I think that this is like an interesting, I want to turn us a little bit and sort of pivot on the idea of a social security number and take the idea that there's a foundation of a sort of immutable thing, right? That or actually no, let's use a credit score because it's better. There's like this like truth that is intrinsic to the world that we're trying to model with the database, right? Which is basically your financial reputation. And we are, just like intelligence, actually measuring the raw thing is impossible. And so we use these proxies and we write down those proxies. And then we rely on the people that keep the proxies. And so we get these sort of chains where there's a thing that is true in the world. And then there are people who are in the sort of like business of writing down that thing and becoming a proxy for truth. And I think that's where that sort of organization is particularly problematic when the thing that you are modeling is immutable, such as are you or are you not presently infected with a virus, or what is the current status of your health? That kind of, there's a reason that we really care about healthcare data and that we have a massive amount of regulation about what you can and cannot do with it, because it's a thing that it's the kind of information that once learned, if it is learned truly, it can't be unlearned because it's tied to a sort of like truth in the world. And I think that I have to come out and admit, I hate admitting this on this call. I have done a bit of a 180 on blockchains in the world of coronavirus. I know, because if you really think about it, if you tie like this question of like trust in state, and like for me, the frustration with blockchains has always been that they seem like a lot of work for very little payoff. But when we talk about this idea of like, okay, now we have these immutable sources of information, and we're going to put some intermediary between us and that thing, and somebody, like we now have a very pressing need for accuracy on this. We need to know, to be able to contact trace, to actually understand how a virus is propagating through the community. This is a situation where the freedoms of the individual and the freedoms of the group are in direct diametric pressure there, and they need to be solved. And if you end up in a situation where someone steps forth and says, you look at any system design and says, okay, we'll put one person forth and they will become the sort of like arbiter of contract tracing, or like Apple and Google's sort of partnership to put forth a framework for this. I find that to be subpar. I think that's in the long run. I think that it's like putting healthcare data, this is fundamentally healthcare data. This fundamentally cannot change. And like putting all the cards in that stack, like long term, like imagine we had enough time to like work out a blockchain, like this should be on a blockchain. We should actually be using a decentralized ledger for this kind of thing. And participation in this should be sort of like, I personally now have switched to the view that like, yeah, you should probably just be mandated to participate in that sort of like thing. I know it sounds crazy, but like I think that to those who know me, the idea of me being okay with the idea of a blockchain is a weird feeling, but but it feels like it's a solution for which, or a problem for which, many of the existing solutions just don't feel like they cut it. Like I just like, how do you not get the NSA out of whoever holds those keys? How do you not get some really dramatic, like this will have material effects on people's lives, and the disclosure of that information is like, it's really problematic. So I'll just back away from that. But I wanted to try and tie this to coronavirus because that was in the readings.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I think there are other people who want to respond. I just was a little confused at the end there. I mean, the problem that I see is, the thing that's an obvious problem is privacy with healthcare data. It wasn't clear to me how blockchain fixes that, because what it does is blockchain allows you to authorize, to validate a claim, but it doesn't really help you keep things private, does it?
It can also be used to mean that the number of actors in a space cannot be totally known, right? So you can actually set up a blockchain so that everybody participating, it's basically like a network of only social security numbers that can change. but have to change in a causal way. This isn't a blockchain in the classic sense, but the notion that you would any situation, any sort of system design that involves a central arbiter that says we are going to be the sort of like source of truth on this. Again, I think it's important to sort of highlight the problem here, because you have an immutable source of information, and then a lot of people who are vying to be a central arbiter of truth. And to me, that is the definition of a data monopoly. They're being asked to be granted a monopoly over a sort of truth granting style of information. And anybody can join the sort of mining process of a blockchain, right? Anybody can participate in, I could right now create a key pair and buy Bitcoin and assign it to a wallet. I can be an actor in a sort of system that allows me to be a part of it. So anybody can start participating in a blockchain that properly hides your identity, but allows you to sort of control the disclosure of information. Does that make sense?
I feel like I'm a little bit slow on it, but I want to let other people respond. I think other people have responses.
No. I don't feel like talking about blockchain.
Totally. I know it's anathema in many contexts. I'm sorry.
I'm happy to listen if there's a case to be made, but
what if we instead of blockchain, let's take away this sort of like radicalizing word and just talked about a decentralization where you need the thing that you need, because that's the characteristic you need to focus on, right? You need some system where I think that we need a system where, like, ideally we would be seeking out alternatives to this type of data monopoly. Where
have you been keeping up with like the design of privacy in those solutions?
Yeah, that they're putting forth, and they're the one specifically the Apple paper, the Apple Google paper.
Yeah, there was that, and then I think France had another model, France and Germany, although last I knew Germany had capitulated to, there was a privacy trade-off, right? In terms of sort of who, well, I don't remember very well now, but the design of that system was such that, if I remember correctly, and it's been a little while and I didn't pay that much attention, but like the design was such that a person could find out whether they'd been in contact with other people infected without actually there being a central database of people.
Yeah.
Like Google, despite being, they don't do big evil corporation, was the one advocating for, people can find out. Oh, I think it was with more precision, geographic and time precision, enough geographic and time precision that you could actually figure out exactly who it was. Whereas the European solution would just tell you that you had been around somebody who had been infected, but that required more of a central source of truth, as you say, synoptic view of the world. Whereas the Google solution, just sort of matched numbers up, and then you knew your numbers, the set of all numbers that you'd ever advertise yourself under.
Mm-hmm.
So like that seemed okay.
Yeah, and actually I should have backed away from the phrase blockchain. It was the wrong phrase to use at the time because it's too problematic. So that's the point that I'm trying to sort of like seek in on. Although it is not classically called a blockchain, it is leveraging many techniques that have been really, really hardened and improved in the blockchain space in a way that, like, I think we would not, I honestly don't think that we would be in a position to vet the kinds of those papers. Like I know just personally, there's no way I would have been able to without like reading around cryptography that we do for privatized, decentralized ledgers. So yes, I think that I don't want to be triggering with the phrase blockchain, but I very much agree. I think that's the thing we want, right? We want the Apple Google paper as proposed, in the sense of being a decentralized source of information. I apologize for saying the word blockchain.
I'm just going to start sipping my whiskey over here. No, I don't know. What were we talking about? We started talking about social security numbers and credit card scores? Are we still mining that thread, as it were?
I have a totally different direction if anyone wants that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I'm curious about, and this might be a short topic because some of you might be more informed than me on this, but if we say that a monopoly is having the sole source of a particular thing or type of thing, given that, well, so an exercise that I would like to do sometime, and if this exists somewhere, I would love to see it, is I want to see like the version, the parts of me that Google has come to own over the years. The most dramatic of those, I think, is when they bought Fitbit quietly. Most people don't even like know that. It's just like, huh, so you have been reading my emails for years, know who all of my contacts are and where I go based on my phone, and you're probably in my home listening to every word that I say, and there's a camera, and additionally, you know my heart rate every day at every moment. If we take all that and feed that into a machine learning model, the number of columns they've added means that they can make categorically different models of people than anybody else. So I'm kind of positing that as a data monopoly that's quite different from our other definitions.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I'm trying to sort of model that sort of, I don't know, philosophically, like what's going on. Who has a monopoly on what? They have a great deal of information. That's a resource, right? That allows them to do certain things that other people can't provide to me. And so I have no alternative, but it's also, I have no alternative for certain, no, that's not true. They do a better job of certain things because they have all of that data, but it's not actually that much better of a job, to be honest.
Well, I guess I should clarify, right? So I don't mean that as a consumer, we have no choice but to be owned by Google. What I'm saying is that Google, like if I were purchasing models of people, Google would be the only supplier of this complete of a model.
You know, why isn't that just because they have a better product than other people?
Isn't that where monopolies come from?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, monopolies, a lot of them come from guns and dollars. You know, like where do the oil monopolies come from? They come from suppressing various kinds of dissent over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, yeah, I don't think it's about being better.
But I mean, it is a good question. Just like, is doing something really well or having a lot of power in that sense a threat in a similar way to a monopoly? Although I guess that wasn't the point you were making, because you were talking about if I wanted to buy personas, and I'm still in the consumer frame.
This is where I really think that the like economic origin of the term monopoly is unhelpful, because I think that the problem that monopolies pose is a concentration of power which is difficult to dislodge. So it's a concentration of power that by its nature increases, right? And so you know, it arises perhaps in part from a market position, and so it maybe has its origins in economic phenomena, but the problem that matters the most is the increasing scope of the entities, of the corporate entities, you know, control over your actions. And so like what we're wary of, I think, is this sense of a positive feedback loop for those for corporations operating at a certain scale with data at a certain scale, that makes it like increasingly difficult for alternatives to emerge, whether those are other companies or other ways of life. I don't know, that's what seems to me like the evil that one would be concerned about.
Yeah, and the mechanism, at least in Google, Facebook, Twitter's cases, is actually making things free, which is sort of interesting, right? That's the lock-in. People like people lament the loss of Google Reader, not just because it was such a wonderful thing, but because they made it free and totally took all the oxygen out of the system. That just seems worth pointing out.
I really like your framing a lot better, Matt. Just like, how do we dislodge people who have ended up in positions of power? And I think that the data monopoly term that we sort of initially came up with and built a whole reading group around sort of leads us, it sort of puts an economic slant on things that creates this like self-disqualifying thought loop. Because I think that like every time we've gone to talk about a data monopoly, we kind of want to talk about this sense of powerlessness. We want to talk about this sense of like, of frustration that, and then the like, I think I sort of helped poison the well with the like economies of scale type thing, because there is a point where this tops out, where like Google just gets so deep into your life that nobody could ever get that deep into your life. No one could ever amass such a complete picture because of these positive feedback loops of sort of like, well, we bought Fitbit and then we blah, blah, blah. And it becomes something that could not ever be replicated. And worse than, but I think that that's not nearly as sort of important as the question that you've put forth, Matt, of like how do we have a framework for understanding a threshold at which it feels like someone has amassed a sort of picture of you that you are now beholden to, instead of it being beholden to you, where like just to throw a heuristic out there, like every now and then I'll just like pretty routinely just try and change my behavior really aggressively on the internet, including like writing bots that'll just like go to very different websites or like do all kinds of weird stuff just to like see if I can shake the ads or the bucketing of which sort of like thing I'm in into like a more interesting, it's purely for fun, but it's fun to see how easy it is to get the machine to think that you're somebody else. And it makes me feel re-empowered because it's like, oh, cool. I've been out searching for like pregnancy tests and like, a bunch of like classic, like different things that would not match my typical characteristics. Although these days, yeah, it's more common than it used to be. But I think it's just fun and interesting, but like, that feels like really like a guerrilla tactic and really like a sort of last resort to what is admittedly a sense of helplessness in the face of a very complete picture of who I am as a person.
Are you saying that we should be, like, to me, those are issues of sort of privacy and autonomy. Are you saying that we should understand, are you saying those are more interesting than data monopolies, or are you saying that those are related to the idea of monopolies?
I think it is. I think we have the framing wrong. And then like, I want to talk about that sense of helplessness and like that, like, where does that come from and how do we?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's, that's the drive behind the whole sort of decentralization wave, is wanting to sort of cut free.
I mean, I think there's like an interesting test for this, which is like, if you were to think of like Apple, do you feel like Apple has a data monopoly? For those of you who use Apple devices, do you feel like Apple has a data monopoly on your data? And like, when I pose that test to myself, I don't feel the same way that I do about Facebook and Google. And like, it's interesting to try to piece apart why I think that is. Like, there's definitely lock-in bits. Like, there's a running joke with my roommates about how we will not let someone into our apartment who's not on iMessage because we can't have a roommate group chat. And like, like, so there are like lock-in bits that could tick the anti-competitive bit, but like fundamentally, I don't think there's the same feeling of like there is a aside from maybe like USB ports, like that there is like yeah, like a lack of control over my information. But then I do notice if anyone has ever ventured to check out Apple Maps in the last decade, like it does do some weird stuff if you ever tried using it, or like if after using it, because I was using it when I was up in my mountain cabin, like it does pick up things where it kind of gets like kind of awkward. Like it'll predict like, oh, you're about to like go. So like I will give you directions because like on Thursdays you go to this restaurant to like order stuff, or like we think this is home for you. When I was like in Canada, like it guessed my Airbnb as home and like it marks it as home. And like I think if it was another, like it was creepy from Apple's perspective, but knowing what Apple has already said, it felt less creepy. But thinking about like, there's something I think there about like what is the autonomy of choice. But even the, yeah, I think there's like a nugget of a thing there, which I will leave it at that before having more in. But or yeah, I mean, maybe it is like business models versus motivations. Like when a business model is like very clearly aligned with like ads and like the access of your information, it feels a little bit different. And then like when it's also then compounded by they will make more money if you stay on. So how do they engage you? And this idea of like psychological manipulation, Apple, while overpriced, is like very direct to like, you are just going to hand us money and that's going to be the end of this transaction. And like, yeah, I don't know.
I think that's a really important characteristic. And sort of jump in if anyone else had a thought. But like, it seems that your trust, your belief that you are or not participating in that you are not being dominated by a power structure is tied to your faith in the institution that you're participating in. Fair? What do you think, Jonathan? Is that resonate?
I think so. I think there's like something about like, and I like, not to get back into the D-Webby side of this, I do think there is something about like how these technologies came to be, where like I think there is something that is about like there is always like an implicit choice, and some of it is like a function of the technology stack, where then it feels like it is much more natural for things that are funded by ads to like imply that there is some sort of access. Like even thinking through, like what does Facebook even do when they say, like, I don't know if anyone's ever tried this as an experiment. I signed up for like their ads platform just to see like if I was an advertiser, what would I have access to? And like, it is interesting. Like, I mean, you basically can put in a bunch of keywords and you can specify like a geography and stuff. And like, yeah, like it or you can even like take a look and see like Facebook now lets you see what they think they know about you. And it's like wildly off. And so there is like definitely a lot of outrage. And I think rightly so, like there's directionally correct outrage, I guess, is maybe the right thing to phrase it as, where it's like, I think there's like principles that are like not necessarily enshrined in like any law, or like there's no faith that like Facebook is like abiding by things that are like giving freedom of choice. And then in this black box, people get really worried about like, what are all the ways in which this could be misused and used incorrectly? And I think that's like part of the issue, where there's like not a ton of trust. And especially when the business model, it would skew heavily in the favor of this other organization, if, and this other organization being Facebook, the business model would be benefited greatly by abusing that trust, then it's really hard. And especially, I mean, Facebook is a specific example where like the CEO has many times been like, I don't care about data privacy. So like, there's also that. Yeah, I don't know.
I was gonna say we're all kind of ribbing on Facebook's ability to give advertisers like the ways you can get around the algorithms and how the targeting is honestly not that good. But I'm trying to remember what book it was that I was reading that made this point. But basically, just because they're not good at it now doesn't mean that the huge amount of data that they have and are continuing to gather won't become usable in much better models. And in fact, that is the most likely outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to know if maybe the term data monopolies is not so useful, and really all we care about is the coercive power of data stores, and maybe there's something to be said for the way in which the distribution of that data creates coercive power. So if you're the principal actor that has access to this particular data store, then you have the capacity to coerce the market, but also to coerce people into certain kinds of actions. And I think maybe a lot of our our thinking in the last 3-4 years is influenced by this idea that there's this kind of dark nexus between experimental psychology and fine-grained profiling that creates a manipulative power that is incompatible with democratic practice, and also incompatible with the Enlightenment. With the idea that that it's possible to create a state of free individuals who are capable of autonomous rational thought. I think that there's something about data concentration that undermines that. But data monopoly is not. Maybe that is kind of probably what we care about. Probably that's along the lines of what we care about with data monopoly, but data monopoly is not actually a great term for describing that.
Peter.
But I like what you just said. Oh no, I just lost what I was going to say. If you were going to say something, if I could.
Yeah, totally. I just want to build on what Matt was saying. I think that the notion of the dark nexus is the capacity to build a personalized hallucination, right? Like this idea that we could sort of like really, and I posted in chat that I'm thinking a lot about the right to be forgotten, right? Like this, we are moving forwards in time, and that is always the case. But like right now, we are very much at the sort of like dawn of a place where people are starting to amass these profiles, and we're in new territory, right? We don't know what this is like. We don't know what the effects of this level of knowledge totality or perceived knowledge totality really are, and my lack of the scary thing is like, there are many of us. Maybe I'm one of them. Maybe everyone falls somewhere on the spectrum of like the realizing at some point that the database that accumulates of you is the sum choice of every decision you've ever made on any platform, right? So like every time you choose to post, every single time you choose to disclose something, it is this like little carrot that accumulates and accumulates and accumulates, and it's sort of this like it is a unidirectional knowledge acquisition. And that is a very sort of like scary thing when you look backwards, right? When you realize that you have no capacity to control the tail of this thing. And I mean, I think when we move through the world, that we are, as a people, as a species, forget stuff. We don't all, as a culture, like I don't remember every bad interaction I've had with everybody in the world. Databases don't, and they don't have that forgetfulness property when maintained properly. And that's a very cognitively difficult thing to get your head around. It's really hard to understand what it's like to live in a world that is permanent in some ways and ephemeral in others, depending on where you are, who you're speaking to, and how you are communicating. And I think that is I think that's the kernel that we're kind of getting at with this data monopolies framing that the conversation that's evolved out of this is like, to me, is the like, I want the capacity to turn to that memory machine and say, I would selectively like you to forget about this and have an enshrined law that says
that I have the choice to do that, that I as a rational person know that this is a one-way thing and I will suffer some loss in service quality for it, but I want to do it anyway.
Isn't there, who has the right to be forgotten? Is that an EU thing? EU. So I just wanted to sort of pull out, I know I'm sort of categorizer, I'm not proud of it, but there's my information, which is in no way a commodity. It's the, the things that are, my interactions, the things that I say, my emails and so forth, and control over that is sort of one bucket, which I've been thinking about a lot. Sort of where my brain has been most of the time. There's information about me and how I'm seen, which is I think maybe what you're talking more about. And then there's sort of information that's basically a commodity, whether it's Getty Images or Google's indexes or Amazon's listings, things that probably could be reproduced. They're things that have been published, right? Or public observations about the world, Google Maps and so forth. We have to wrap up, do we?
I personally have to go as well.
Okay, we've been going for a little while.
Usually we do an hour and a half.
Anyway, I think each of those things we could sort of go down and it would be its own domain, and I'd love to create the space for that. Just the concerns are very different, and the tools we have available are very different. Questions about like the role of open source, the role of government, the role of trust in non-governmental organizations like Google and Apple. And I'd love to get a chance to talk about the more personal stuff if there's ever a space for that.
I think that's a really actually excellent way to conclude. Thank you for coming up with all that.
I'm glad we got there just in the nick of time.
Yeah.
It's hard to feel out like a space, right? I've never studied law. I haven't didn't read articles. But it's just, it's a philosophical exercise, right? We have to sort of feel these things out and like figure out what we actually care about. So I really appreciate that, sort of bringing it back to, what are our bodies telling us? And yeah, so thank you all. This has been fun. This certainly exceeded my expectations.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for putting together the reading list.
For doing all the work.
Yeah.
So for next time, I should be looking, rather than the GitHub thing, I should be looking at one of these things somewhere else? HackMD or something? Or
no, GitHub is, we'll have a more ratified reading list beforehand.
You were in the right spot.
Okay, cool.
It should have been PR'd to the README, but it wasn't. But
that's my bad.
For the next one.
Jonathan, it's all good. You can't be expected to both crack the process and facilitate and join the first call in one go. Yeah, and so next one's in a month. Stay tuned, sports fans. I think Don and I are facilitating the next one.
Oh, fantastic. That would be super fun.
Is that right, Kelsey? If not, sorry. Yeah, no, that's right. Cool. So yeah.
Trust. It's a trust. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
I will come up for air.
I gotta go. All right.
Thank you so much.
Good to see everybody's faces, and nice to meet you, Peter.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. Do it again soon.
Yeah, sure. I hope so. I mean, I expect it.
Don't let those squirrels give you shit. You tell them who you are.
They wake me up every morning at 3, digging through the fucking house. But and now they're getting active. Oh, it's killing me. So I'm gonna go bang on my walls. See you guys later.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Everyone.
Bye.
Yo. I do have time to chat, but we can go to a different one that is not recorded.
Totally. I will email you a link. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.